Hola, bueno, en primer lugar, buenas noches y decirles que es un placer estar acá. Es una lástima que no tenga podido ir en persona, pero me siento muy bien representado por todos que están ahí. Voy a proseguir en inglés, entonces dame un segundo para que pueda compartir un poco la presentación. Eh, so, this presentation gives you a bit of an overview of the type of research we have been doing with ayahuasca since 2006. My name is Draulio. I'm a full professor at the Brain Institute here in Natal, in Brazil, the northeast of Brazil, at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte. Our research with ayahuasca is twofold. On one hand, and this is how we started, we were interested in understanding what is ayahuasca, what is the neural basis of ayahuasca. But ayahuasca is a decoction. It's a name that comes from the Quechua language spoken by Amerindians. It's been translated by the vine of the souls. It's a decoction that comes from two plants that are traditional in the Amazonian region. One of the plants, it's called Psychotria viridis. It's from the coffee family, so you see the one on the left. This is the Psychotria viridis. And the Psychotria viridis is rich on this tryptamine, N-dimethyltryptamine, which has a very powerful psychedelic property attached to it. The other plant, it's rich in Banisteriopsis caapi, and it's rich in these enzyme or monoamine oxidase inhibitors. What you have is you mix the leaves from one plant together with the bark of the other plant, and then you have this brownish liquid with a very traditional smell and taste. Later, it was found out that, in fact, the indigenous population have this very brilliant invention that mix these two plants, and the mixing of these two plants allow NN-DMT to have a psychoactive effect. And this is because NN-DMT, as any other tryptamine, it doesn't have an effect if you ingest it alone, such as serotonin, dopamine. None of these have an effect if you ingest it alone. This is as well as with DMT. So if you ingest DMT, you won't have any effect of DMT because on our guts, we have a number of enzymes that are called monoamine oxidase that degrades DMT or any other monoamine. So what the indigenous population have invented is that when they mix this other plant is rich in monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So in other words, it's rich on a molecule that inhibits the activity of these enzymes that we have in our gut that degrades DMT. So this formulation confers a central nervous system effect or a psychedelic effect to ayahuasca. What are the main effects of ayahuasca? So what is it? What's a psychedelic effect that I've been talking about? The effects of ayahuasca, they generally last for about 4 hours. They start to kick in 20 minutes after ingestion, and they start usually with a little bit of relaxation, a lot of yawning, until around 40 minutes after the ingestion. Then there are what we would call more typical psychedelic effects. The first one is the visions with the eyes closed. Very similar to what happens when you're dreaming, a lot more than people have been tending to call these substances hallucinogenic, but this is not a good term in general. They come with these very intense images with the eyes closed. A lot of times ayahuasca induces vomiting and diarrhea sometimes. Nausea, it's very frequent in the ayahuasca experience. There is a significant increase in introspection, which is the ability to see your own thoughts and your own emotions, or to be aware of your own thoughts and your emotion. And ayahuasca is also known by what would be an increase on what we would call mystical experiences, or more spiritual type of experiences. These experiences have been first found by science during these expeditions that this English ethnobotanist took in the Amazon region. This 15 years expedition that started in 1849 explored all these black regions that you see in the map. And in these 15 years of expedition, Richard Spruce was collecting the use of different plants by indigenous population and trying to understand in what kind of context those substances were being used. And that was in 1852 when Spruce first encountered ayahuasca in the upper river of the Uapés River. It encountered ayahuasca for the first time, and then it encountered ayahuasca in a couple of other regions on his expedition, also being used most frequently as for medicinal purposes. So this was the main use of ayahuasca by a curandero as a medicinal purpose. Around the beginning of the 20th century, ayahuasca reached the urban centers, mainly by the hands of this guy, Raimundo Irineu Serra, or simply Mestre Irineu, who funded in 1930 a first religion around ayahuasca. So ayahuasca is the main sacrament of a few religions in Brazil, and one of them, and the first one, was the Santo Daime Church, who gathered first in 1930 and who had the first ceremony in 1930. Ayahuasca is legal in Brazil, particularly for religious purposes. And here I list the three main churches that use ayahuasca as a sacrament: the Santo Daime Church, the União do Vegetal, and the Barquinha. In the last census we had in 2010, around 50,000 people have reported themselves as people that ayahuasca was their main religion. These religions, they usually gather every 2 weeks. And every one of them has a very syncretic attitude towards many different aspects of the religion. We started becoming interested in studying ayahuasca in 2006. The first few studies that we did with ayahuasca were most interested in understanding the neural basis of ayahuasca. What I'm showing here is our images from our first functional magnetic resonance imaging study, in which we had individuals, very experienced people, very experienced with the use of ayahuasca, inside a magnetic resonance imaging scanner, and then having their brain scanned while they're visualizing or trying to imagine images that they were seeing or imagining. What I'm showing here are the brain areas. So what you see in these colored areas depicted in the brain are the regions in which we found an increased activity when the individuals were under the influence of ayahuasca, trying to imagine something. What we see here is that, in fact, and this is one hypothesis that comes along from this first study, is the idea that maybe one of the effects of ayahuasca is allowing you to see visually your own thoughts and your own emotions. The second type of evidence that we have with ayahuasca comes also from a neuroimaging study. And in this neuroimaging study, we were interested in understanding these increases in introspection, or the ability that we gain to be aware to our own thoughts and to our own emotions. Here, what I'm showing on the left is one of these networks that's called the default network. And on the right-hand side, you see the salience network. These two brain networks, they have been related with awareness that we have to our own experience. So for instance, if you're meditating and you're gaining more aware to your own thoughts while you're meditating, the type of modulation that you see in brain networks would be very similar to the type of modulations we saw with ayahuasca. In fact, there is a straight parallel between the experience with ayahuasca and a meditation experience, both the practice and the state of meditation. When we were doing these studies, we partnered with one church in Brazil, one of the Santo Daime churches here in Brazil, in order to recruit subjects that had a lot of experience with ayahuasca, and that were willing to go inside an MRI scanner to have their brain scanned while under the influence of ayahuasca, which is definitely not trivial to be under the influence of ayahuasca inside an MRI scanner. So when we were there recruiting the individuals, it became very clear that a lot of people that were there in one of these churches, they were there because they found in the church some type of relief from some condition that they were experiencing. So people would spontaneously come to us and say, "Oh, I'm here because I'm feeling better from my depression, because of my anxiety, because of abusive use of certain substances such as crack, tobacco, cocaine, or anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder." So a few of these individuals would just say, I'm here because I got better from these conditions. And that was when we decided to start conducting clinical trials with ayahuasca. And ever since, we have been conducting trials in patients that are called treatment-resistant depression. This is the result of our first trial with patients with treatment-resistant depression. This trial and patients with treatment-resistant depression are the ones who do not respond to our current available treatments to depression. So in this first experiment, what we did was to have 17 patients with treatment-resistant depression coming to our university hospital and going through a single experience with ayahuasca. All these patients, besides having treatment-resistant depression, they were naive to ayahuasca. That was their first experience that they would have with ayahuasca. What you see here in these two first lines on the top left, what you see are the symptoms of depression measured both before, during, and after the intervention with ayahuasca. On the left, what you see is that before the ayahuasca intake, these patients have a very significant and severe depression. One day after the ayahuasca intake, they already presented a significant decrease in their symptoms of depression. Curiously, after a single intervention with ayahuasca, we observed a very rapid, so meaning that one day after the session, we had an antidepressant effect, and this effect would last for 21 days. This is how long we were able to measure the effects of ayahuasca. On the right, you see a couple of brain images that we collected 8 hours after the ayahuasca intake. And what you see on the right are some of the brain structures that were still with a higher activity 8 hours after the ayahuasca intake. These three regions that I'm going to name them the nuclear accumbens, the subgenual cortex, and the insula, all of the three ones, they are usually they are involved in mood disorders in general. So it makes sense that we've found some increased activity of these structures. These trial, although the results are very interesting, they did not control for a very important effect, which is the placebo effect. So our follow-up trial was a randomized placebo-controlled trial. And these type of trials, half of the populations of patients with treatment-resistant depression were submitted to a single intervention with a placebo substance, and the other half was submitted to a experience with ayahuasca. Remember that every patient that we had, they were naive to ayahuasca, so that was their first experience with ayahuasca. And we also had a placebo. What you're seeing here in the picture is our placebo substance that we've developed in the lab. The placebo substance is a mix of yeast, beer yeast, water, brown-colored colorant, zinc sulfate, and citric acid. So the resulting formulation had a very sour taste, bitter taste, and this brownish color. So it resembled some of the effects of ayahuasca. The other curiosity about our placebo is that it has zinc sulfate. And zinc sulfate, besides being bitter, it also has, it also produces some gastrointestinal distress. So a lot of the people who went to a placebo session felt nausea and a little bit of gastrointestinal distress. These are the main results of our trial. Fernanda Palhan was the first author of this study, and what you see in red are the results of the ayahuasca. What you see in blue are the results of the placebo. So the first point is baseline, means before the intervention, 1 day after the intervention, 2 days after the intervention, and 7 days after the intervention. What you see is that 1 day after the intervention, already there is a significant decrease in the depressive symptoms of these patients already 1 day after the session. This was not the case of the placebo, so there was a significant between group difference, meaning that the group of individuals that went into a ayahuasca session, they significantly improved. They improved a lot more significantly than the group who took the placebo substance. Besides understanding or looking at the effects of ayahuasca, we also wanted to understand where the effects come from. So we collected a number of different markers from these individuals, blood, MRI, behavioral tests, and so on. And what I'm showing here are the 24 biomarkers or blood sampling data that we collected from these individuals. And what we saw from these are the three main results that we found. The first one is that together with the decrease in the symptoms of depression, there is a decrease in inflammatory biomarkers, such as the C-reactive proteins. So in other words, the patients who underwent to an intervention with ayahuasca, they've presented a decreased concentration of C-reactive protein. Also, the patients that went in the ayahuasca session, they presented a decrease in cortisol or a rebalance of cortisol after the experience. And cortisol is a very significant marker in our blood that's related to stress. The other biomarker that also stands out in all the biomarkers that we've measured were brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a biomarker that's related to neuroplasticity. So in other words, we see that together with the reduced symptoms of depression in these patients, we also observed that these reduction in symptoms of depression, they come together with changes in our inflammation system, changes in our stress system, and changes in our neuroplastic system. And all of these three seem to contribute to the effects of ayahuasca. A part of the experience also contributes to the effects of ayahuasca. So in other words, the individuals who had the most strongest experience, they were also the ones who presented the most significant benefit from ayahuasca. In these studies, we have also been looking for the impact of ayahuasca in suicidality. And this is very important because usually the medication that we have available for depression, they take 2 weeks in order for the effects to kick in. So in other words, if you have depression, and if you look for a psychiatrist, and if you're prescribed a regular antidepressant, it's very likely that this will take about 2 weeks in order for you start to feel the benefit from the medication. What we're seeing with ayahuasca and with other psychedelics is a very rapid effect of ayahuasca. So in other words, we see that one day after the session, there is already a significant decrease in the symptoms of depression of these patients. This then becomes very significantly important for cases of depression that comes along with suicidality, or in other words, patients with depression that has a high risk of committing suicide, because we know that depression usually suicide is usually a very frequent outcome. So what we're trying then to do is to understand whether or not ayahuasca could also reduce levels of suicidality in these patients one day after the session. And that we found. So from our trial, besides seeing that there was a reduction in the symptoms of depression one day after the session, we also observed that there is a decrease in the level of suicidality in these patients one day after the session. We also explored the effects of ayahuasca in some of the brain networks one day after the session. And what we found is that those two brain networks that we found highly activated during the effects of ayahuasca, they were also modulated one day after the intervention. So in other words, one day after the session with ayahuasca, these two networks, the default network and the salience network, were still with a changed activity with regards to how it was before the session. These networks and all this story has a lot to do with what we call spontaneous thoughts. The default network and the salience network, they are related to what we call spontaneous thoughts. Spontaneous thoughts is a very well-known process from every one of us. And we are aware of a lot of the ways that the spontaneous thoughts express themselves. One of them is what we call mind wandering. So mind wandering is a process in which you should be looking at something, or you should be doing some task, and your mind simply wanders off the task that you're supposed to be doing. Rumination is another expression of the spontaneous thoughts. And rumination is very frequent in patients with depression. It's a type of thought, very negative thought, and recurrent thought. So it's a type of thought that you're always thinking about that negative thought recurrently, always thinking about it. This is what happens very regularly with the depression. So a lot of the patients with depression, they do have a very significant ruminative type of thoughts. And what we're seeing here is that a lot of the changes that we find after an ayahuasca experience, it also comes along with changes that happens on these process of spontaneous thinking. So all of these together take us to the idea that not only ayahuasca, but a lot of these substances or psychedelic substances, such as psilocybin or mescaline or DMT alone, they seem to play a very significant role in reducing or alleviating mental health conditions in a number of conditions. More and more, what science is showing us is that these substances have a very significant potential effect in being used in different mental disorders, as is the case of depression, of post-traumatic stress disorder, and anxiety. And the clinical trials have been advancing, and I truly believe that this is a very important and opportunity for both psychiatry and for psychology to better understand the human mind on one hand, and to alter conditions that today our current medicine have very little to do about. So with that, I thank you, and I'm here for the conversation and for the questions that you might have. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Draulio, for the nice presentation. I believe that the data is very clear and very robust. But I want also to say that your Spanish is very good. So it was nice to hear you.
Gracias.
Well, to start this conversation, I was wondering, because you said that the ayahuasca has been used by the Indians for 1,000 years or a lot of years, and it seems that has been, studied only in the 15 years, or I don't know. So, have you found in the manuscript or texts that in the literature that any beneficial effect of ayahuasca in Indians, or before the scientists took ayahuasca? Beneficial effects of ayahuasca on that population? The Indians?
Yeah. So, well, the first thing, and the very first part of your question, which is very interesting, is the following. How is it that we know how long ayahuasca has been used by indigenous population? Because it comes from a substance that comes from two plants in the Amazonian region. So it's very difficult, and it's a liquid. It's different than sniff, for instance. So in fact, we see that the indigenous populations have been using psychoactive substances for thousands of years. And the way that we can prove with science that this is true come a lot from the artifact that you collect from archaeological sites, right?
Yeah.
So how is it that you can, what kind of archaeological artifact can you collect to prove that ayahuasca has been used by a number of years? Because the artifact is a glass and two plants. So then the oldest, I'd say, scientific evidence that we have, then it comes from around the year 1000. Wow. And the evidence that we have comes in a bag, in a shamanic bag. So in this shamanic bag, it was found substances such as harmine. And harmine is one of the substances that are used in ayahuasca. So this is the first part of your question. When is ayahuasca has been first used by indigenous population? This is the best evidence we have so far. So as to the evidence that we have before science to see if it had a potential effect on treatment for these populations. Well, first is that no, we don't have evidence, but the main reason why we don't have evidence, or one of the reasons why we don't have evidence, is because depression, or the term depression, is something that comes from modern science. In other words, it's very difficult to talk about depression in the 1500s, because it had been even described as a human condition by science, especially if we go to indigenous population. So all the elements around ayahuasca, it's very difficult for science to minimally tackle the importance of ayahuasca in these indigenous population. Ayahuasca is an entity. Ayahuasca is more than it's a medicine, but it is used as a medicine mainly for this indigenous population. But it's also used for envisioning the future by shamans or by not only the curandero, but by the cacique of the tribe, the leader of the tribe. If the leader of the tribe wants to understand what is that for a decision, so I have to make a decision on how to proceed and how to guide my people. Ayahuasca would serve as a possibility to help this individual to get some guidance from. Ayahuasca is also used for war, to go to war. So you see that ayahuasca is in the indigenous population is much more than what we have been doing with ayahuasca, in one sense that we're bringing ayahuasca and constraining ayahuasca in the lab. And that, of course, then we can go a little bit deeper in the type of conclusions that we take with ayahuasca, translate those effects into what science understand, and then eventually translate that into the urban centers in general.
Okay, yeah, yeah. It's more like a molecule. It's like a part of the culture. It's ayahuasca.
Exactly.
And thinking about the amazing effects that you show us, I have because you clearly show that ayahuasca can decrease the symptom of depression, at least at 7 or 21 days. So it's amazing because you give ayahuasca to the people. I mean, one drink, I would say, and the effect lasts. It seems that the effect, you can see the effect at least by looking at the symptoms of depression. So it seems that actually it's doing something to neurons, to the brain, to the connections that are lasting. So do you have any idea? I know that you show us showed some markers, the inflammation, but do you have any idea what it's doing to the neurons, I mean to the circuits, maybe more neurons or maybe more connections that are mediating this effect?
Sure. Yeah, this is a very good point. And in fact, is something that's been largely debated on the literature in general. And the reason is, so a lot of groups, including our group, have been finding these therapeutic and very rapid effects of ayahuasca, but not only rapid, as you said, it lasts for some time. So then the second question arises, which is where the effects come from, right?
Yeah.
So and then we can divide, and the discussion in the literature today is pretty much divided into two main groups of scientists.
Okay.
A first group of scientists believe that the effects come from the mystical type of experiences that these individuals have under the influence of the substance. So in other words, the transcendence of the experience would be the reason why you would have those effects. Part of our subjects in general, patients and healthy individuals, they did have these type of experiences, even if they were in the university hospital. They had these type of experiences. But they also reported a lot that during the experiences, that they could feel as if they were into a psychotherapy session.
Wow.
And in fact, these substances are known as teacher plants. They're teacher plants in a sense that there is a knowledge inherent to the plant. And that knowledge, when you are under the influence of the plant, is observed by the individual who is under the influence of the substance, of the formulation. What happens then is that a lot of our patients would say, I feel as if I had 4 years of psychotherapy in these 4 hours. Or other patients would say, I didn't like the experience. For the same reasons, I don't like psychotherapy. So on one hand, and answering your question, it's clear that the experience matter. The quality of the experience matter. And that is to say then that for whoever wants to do an experiment or a treatment with these substances, they have to understand that the environment matter. They have to understand that the company matter. They have to understand that the intention matter. So what people in the community of psychedelics call set and setting. So set as how you are, and setting as how is the environment that you are in, not only physically, but the people that are guiding the experience and so on, the place that you are and so on. So on one hand, it's very clear that the experience matters. But what we are showing, on the other hand, with our biochemical markers being from blood, from the brain, using neuroimaging, is that there is a new level of reorganization of the system. And this reorganization of the system happens in a multi-layer kind of procedure. In other words, we do see then that there is a profound impact in inflammation. And we know that inflammation has a lot to do with depression, for instance. people that has fibromyalgia, which is a condition, a rheumatological condition that is treated with antidepressants. And it is a clearly link between inflammation and mental and depression. We also see that there is changes in neuroplasticity. So what does neuroplasticity has to do, as you were asking, it's very clear that neuroplasticity it is a very important part of the benefit that people have been feeling with these substances. The fact that you have a long-lasting effect also points out, as you said, to the importance of neuroplasticity in general. We also have, we see this from the neuroimaging perspective as well. So we have a few studies that look for changes in different brain connections. So what we are doing here is to understand that different brain connections, they change the way that the whole brain is being connected in general.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No,
I'm so
it's okay,
sorry.
it's okay. That's nature.
It's outside here, so yeah.
Yeah, so what are you saying at the end is that we cannot split the ayahuasca. I mean, it's not just the molecule, but it's the whole experience that is making the effect at the end. So we cannot think about ayahuasca as like isolating the molecule and then give the molecule to the patient as a possible treatment. And in this sense, I was thinking about, have you considered or have you tested like a second experience? Like, I mean, thinking about a therapy, I would say that maybe it's interesting to think that depression is a long-term, syndrome. It's not going to be curing. So, have you tested like, I don't know, maybe once a month or once every 3 months to visualize a therapy in which you give an experience like any times a year? And behind the question is, do you see any resistance at the end to the molecule? I mean, is it going to be the same effect after several experiences?
Very good point. So the first point is if we have done any type of sequential intervention, and we haven't.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, I believe that this is, there isn't anyone really in the world that so far have been far enough to have it as a treatment. We are still investigating the effects of interventions.
Okay.
So the second part of the question, what you're asking is about tolerance. Tolerance is an effect that's very typical in substances in general, especially the ones that induce misuse or addiction. For instance, alcohol, tobacco, cocaine, all of these substances, they have what we call tolerance. And tolerance is an effect in which when you take a certain dose today of that substance, tomorrow you need to increase the amount of the substance in order to reach the same effect. This is very common with alcohol, like we were saying. Curiously, psychedelics does not have tolerance, particularly DMT. LSD does express some tolerance. So if we're talking about psychedelics in general, then I'd say that mostly it doesn't have tolerance. As for NN-DMT, it doesn't have tolerance. So in other words, you could use it today and tomorrow, and in principle, the effects will not change.
Okay, so it's interesting the point that you are not seeing ayahuasca as a treatment, but as an intervention, I mean, in the patient or in the people. And it's interesting because I think that maybe you're thinking about a therapy that includes the intervention. I mean, you can still have the psychotherapy or the drugs that you're taking for depression, and also the intervention of ayahuasca, like in a
This is exactly how we see it. Perfect. Yes, this is exactly how we see it. So the model that we have been implementing here is a model in which, hopefully, in the near future, you'd have your own psychotherapist, and in the process of your own psychotherapy, your psychotherapist would think that you would benefit from one or a few experiences with these substances. And then you would go to a center that could apply this intervention in a safe manner and in an adequate environment. So you'd have the center, you would apply these 1, 2, 3 interventions, and then you would come back to your own therapist. I also see, Soledad, this is as an intervention. When we think about patients with suicidal ideation, this is a very significant and important problem of psychiatry, because you have a patient that's telling you as a psychiatrist that he or she is about to commit suicide. What can you do as a psychiatrist? Nowadays, you can't do a lot. There are a few treatments, or there are a few interventions that have been appearing as possibilities. For instance, electroconvulsive therapy. It's coming back very clearly. Treatments with ketamine, for instance, is another group of substances that have been more and more being tested as antidepressants of rapid effect. So this is one gap that also I see that psychedelics have a very promising role to play. So if you have a patient with a suicidal ideation, it might be that patient will benefit from this intervention again.
And thinking about at the beginning of the talk, you show a map and when different places where ayahuasca was used by the Indians. So I was wondering if in those different places you can find different kinds of ayahuasca. I mean, they are mixing different kinds of plants, so or at the end they are using the same. So can we like say this is the real ayahuasca, or we have some variants that with different effects?
So the effects, so first question, yes, there are many different formulations of ayahuasca. What I'm presenting as this binary of Banisteriopsis caapi on one hand and Psychotria viridis on the other hand is what we would call the most frequently used formulation of ayahuasca. So all the churches, for instance, they do use that type of formulation, the mix of Banisteriopsis caapi with Psychotria viridis. But even in the churches, there are differences on how they cook or how they make the decoction. And that also leads to subtle effects, to subtle differences in the effects. So in general, the effects are the same, but there are subtleties between the different formulations that you find with ayahuasca.
Okay.
So that you know, the Banisteriopsis caapi is also called ayahuasca. So there are indigenous populations in the Amazon regions, the Tucanos, for instance, that use Banisteriopsis caapi alone without the Psychotria viridis. So only the monoamine oxidase inhibitors and not the dimethyltryptamine. So there are different formulations of ayahuasca, and what I'm presenting here is the most frequently used formulation of ayahuasca, being in the churches or in the indigenous by indigenous populations.
Okay, and thank you very much for that point. And I want now to move maybe to another type of question, because thinking about like drugs that, I mean, like marijuana, or in particular marijuana, that we know now that you can have like a therapeutic use of marijuana, but in general, this is not like something that is received with an open arms. I mean, many people have like it's not open to to legalize marijuana and use like a treatment or like an intervention, depending on the kind of society you're living, depending on many factors that is it allowed or not to use marijuana as a therapeutic intervention. So what happened with ayahuasca? What is your feeling about how is the people in general receiving the idea to use ayahuasca as an intervention, like a very controlled, not like an open therapy, but or intervention, I mean like a legalized? Do you think that the people is open to this? Because you said that in Brazil is already legalized, but do you see any like restrictions or limits to actually to socialize the idea? How is the feeling of this?
Yeah, well, first let me make a comment on the cannabis side of the question. So I believe that, and yes, you're right, it's becoming clearer and clearer of the potential therapeutic benefit of marijuana. But then there was an issue, and this is maybe a particular, maybe an opinion, rather than something that's scientifically oriented, which is, in one sense, the medical marijuana movement tried to skip the formal steps that are needed in order to have a substance approved by the regulatory agencies and then being recognized by these agencies and by science as something that indeed has a therapeutic effect. If I ask you how many randomized placebo-controlled trials that are out there with cannabis, you won't find many.
Okay.
On the other hand, this walked hand by hand with the movement with psychedelics. And if I ask you how many randomized placebo-controlled trials there are with psychedelics, although the movement is a lot newer than the movement with cannabis, there are at least 10.
Wow.
So the psychedelic community and the science around psychedelic is being done in a very strong way. And I believe that this will certainly help the regulatory agencies to understand the power that these substances have to be implemented in the clinics.
Yeah.
So what are the next steps then? Should we try locally? Should we try to have ayahuasca as a medication? And then again, our path here in the lab has been to change a little bit the path, because we don't see ayahuasca as a substance that soon will be used as a therapy in the clinics. But there are other psychedelics that might. Other psychedelics that have a easier production, for instance. It's very difficult, as you were saying, it's very difficult to produce a standardized ayahuasca, for instance. So we should move then to other substances or other molecules. What we're doing then here in the lab is to move to isolated NN-DMT. So instead of using ayahuasca, our next trials that we have in our pipeline will use isolated NN-DMT. So we have 2 trials already on the pipeline. One of them just begun 2 weeks ago, which is to test the inhaled routes of administration of NN-DMT. And we have another trial with the intramuscular routes of administration of NN-DMT. So we also believe, Soledad, and I think that this is a very important point to touch, is the following. So the experience with ayahuasca lasts for about 4 hours. In the case of psilocybin, which is another famous psychedelic, it lasts for 6 hours. In the case of LSD, we're talking 8 to 12 hours. So think how complex would be. So say, as from our experience, from our data, what we found is that indeed ayahuasca have a very significant antidepressant effect one day after the session, and that lasts for a few days. All right. So let's say that this data goes through all the way to phase 3, so that we have a medication. All right.
Yeah.
Now we have a medication, and we have a medication in which you give the medication to your patient. Your patient has to be in a specific clinic. It won't be a medication that the patient will take at home, because we know it's like scuba diving. You shouldn't do it by yourself. So you go into these clinics or the intervention clinics, whatever. Then you have a crew that follows the patient for the whole day, practically. How much will it cost? So very expensive.
Yeah, it's very expensive. Many people, yeah.
Very expensive. So a lot of people, very long. So is this a solution for the mental health crisis that we have right now? We have 1 billion people suffering from some type of mental disorder or mental health condition. 1 billion people. So is this a solution? To have someone for 4 hours inside individuals for 4 hours? Maybe, well, maybe it is. I mean, it depends, but it will be very expensive. The treatments that we find today with ketamine, for instance, they have been running around $5,000. Who has $5,000 to go into a depression treatment? Right?
Yeah.
So we do have the dream here in the lab, when we are working very hard to have these substances being used by a broader population of individuals. We understand and we believe that these substances have a role to play. They are not the silver bullet. Yeah. They're not going to work for everyone, but there are a lot of people that they might work. So
it's an alternative.
It's an alternative, exactly. It's an alternative, for instance, for electroconvulsive therapy, which is the alternative that we have today. Yeah. So we need to find other alternatives. Not that electroconvulsive therapy is the demon. No, it works for a lot of people, and it works well. Yeah. But we need to find other alternatives, and this is where we're moving. Considering also affordability as something that should be in the center of our research. And that's why we're moving to DMT alone.
Yeah.
Because DMT alone, then it's 15 minutes. Yeah. The inhaled route of administration of DMT alone is 15 minutes of effect. So then we have a chance. If we do, Soledad, a parallel to what just happened to us. So let's talk about COVID. At some point, we didn't have a solution. At some point, the solution appeared, which is the vaccine. Yeah. And then we have the vaccine, that's the solution. All right. How long did it take to have the population of Chile vaccinated?
Yeah, maybe a year, I don't know, month. Yeah, month.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. A lot of. How long did it take
time.
to have the whole population vaccinated? Well, 2 years, and we don't have the whole population vaccinated. The whole population that could have gotten the shot. So what I'm trying to say is, how long did it take for a single shot in every individual? 15 seconds?
Yeah.
How long did it take to get the whole population vaccinated? So what I'm saying is that we do have a public health problem. It's 1 billion people. So we need to look for alternatives, but also to look for the alternative within the alternative. And this is what we're doing it.
Yeah, so it's very interesting that you are trying to replicate your experiment, but using the molecules, so then it's going to be more robust or more exact. So I really hope that research and experiment goes in a right way. And here we have like few minutes, so maybe I'm going to change to Spanish. Quizás alguien de la audiencia quisiera hacer unas preguntas. Tenemos unos 6 minutos, así que podemos tomar una pregunta de la audiencia, y si puede ser en inglés o en español, y no sé cómo lo hacemos con el micrófono, para poder tomar la pregunta de la audiencia. Ahí viene alguien. O si quieres te puedes acercar y yo, and then I can translate it. the question.
Hola, muy buenas tardes. Consulta. En Tarapoto, Perú, hay un centro de rehabilitación de toxicomanos, o sea, de temas referido a adicción de drogas, dirigido por Jacques Mabit, que se llama Taquihuasi. Entonces, me gustaría saber si ustedes han podido contactarse con ellos para poder, digamos, ver las experiencias en conjunto y poder aportar entre ustedes a la investigación y al desarrollo de este tema de la ayahuasca. Eso, gracias.
Did you get the?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So I know the center. I know personally Jack Mabi, but we have never really developed any research investigation with the Takaiwazi Center. I know of someone who has been working with the Takaiwazi Center, and there is a very good group that's called ICEERS in Barcelona that have done a few study with the center, I believe. So we were not the scientific people involved with Jack Mabi and the Takaiwazi for now.
Okay, thanks. Tenemos otra pregunta acá, creo, y creo que alcanzamos a hacer estas dos preguntas, o una pregunta, perdón. Yo creo que estaba la persona que estaba atrás, ella, yo creo que yo la vi antes, perdona, pero estamos con el tiempo ahí justo.
Hi, I want to ask you, have you personally traveled with ayahuasca?
Yes, so this started in 2005 when I had my first experience with ayahuasca. Back then, I've graduated in physics, but I've always fascinated about the brain. So the way that I've moved into studying the brain was by understanding that I could understand better the techniques that are used to investigate the brain. So the way I moved into neuroscience was by being a specialist in functional magnetic resonance imaging, electroencephalography, and magnetoencephalography. So in other words, techniques that allows you to see the human brain functioning. So once I had the tools, I was applying these tools to many different human conditions. So for a while in my career, I knew how to operate those tools, and I'd applied it for stroke, epilepsy, time perception, emotion regulation, attention, signal processing, you name it. So I did work in a lot of these different aspects of the technique. And then I had a PhD student of mine back in 2005 who was always going to one of the churches. He was affiliated to one of the churches in the city where I was a professor at. So in November 2005, that was my first experience with ayahuasca. And when I left the experience, it was clear that I should apply the techniques that I knew how to operate to ayahuasca. So my first then study was done with these PhD student of mine, together with me and some other people. And ever since, I'd say that I practice ayahuasca. I think that this is a good way to refer to it. It's just a meditation, a type of a meditation. So I see ayahuasca as one of these practices, very strong and deep one, like a very challenging roller coaster. But it's so a roller coaster that you do in a very in a limited frequency. So let's say that from 2005 to today, I had between 40 and around 40 experiences with ayahuasca.
Okay. In your opinion, the experience of all the hours, you think this is important to have the real effects we want to achieve, or
I guess it depends.
short time
I guess it
would be affect
Sure.
this result?
Sure. So yeah, that's a good point. So I think it depends a lot on what is the intention that you have for that specific experience. So in general, the reason why I'm looking for an ayahuasca experience is the same reason why I do practice yoga. So it's a practice that it allows me to understand myself a little bit better, but this is my intention.
Depend on the people.
A patient with depression, that's not their intention. A patient with depression, they want to get better. So that's a completely different intention. And it might be that, for these different individuals, the experience matter. Like I was saying, we cannot think that these substances are for everyone. It's just like a roller coaster is not for everyone. It's the same thing. So yeah, I do believe that for some people the experience matters, but it depends on the intention.
I want to, we have to finish here. Tenemos que terminar, and I want to thanks for your time, for your clarity, for all the explanation and the presentation. That was very clear for me, and I believe for all the people. And thanks, Draulio, for be here, be virtually, and I hope you can maybe on the next time be here with us. So many thanks for your time. We're gonna get an applause for you. Yeah. So I hope to see you maybe in the next time here in Antofagasta. Bye bye.
Muchas gracias Soledad, de todo, y es un placer, una pena que no pude ir en persona. Me gustaría mucho que capaz el próximo año o en otra oportunidad tenga la oportunidad de estar ahí en persona y a conocerlo en persona también. Muchas gracias por todo.
Te estaremos esperando. Gracias, Draulio, que estés bien.
Gracias.
A las personas que vinieron a escuchar la presentación. Muchas gracias. Hasta luego.